Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Wormy.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, episode 3, season 2, Las Vegas Motor Speedway. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and racing analyst extraordinaire, Chris Wormy. And Wormser, was it true what they told me that you were seen doing naked victory laps around Scottsdale Quarter and Old Town after Kyle Busch found his way into victory lane?
Well, I would have, but then there was an Xfinity race to follow it up right after. So unfortunately, it was right back to work. I actually had some people call me like, where are we going to party? And I'm like, I'm not going to party, man. Let's get this Cole Custer ticket in. So
unfortunately, Cole Custer, great through the first two stages, and the 0-0 let us down, obviously, over that third stage, wrecking himself. But hey, look, you can't have your cake and eat it too. A doubleheader race weekend. Good to see a Kyle Busch performance, even if Custer let us down in the night.
Yeah, it was still great. It was still a great race. I mean, you got to remember that we have a lot attached to Kyle Busch in the way of futures. So definitely nice to see. You know, very rarely do we bet overs, I guess you could say, and so it's nice to have something that's like, hey, we could cash this thing hopefully early in the season, and then take that 18-1 or the 15-1 ticket that we have on the championship and watch that closely and continue to hedge out and guarantee ourselves some money, or at least put ourselves in a position to where we're going to make money no matter who wins in that final race at Phoenix.
And I think it gives us a great place to start. Congrats, obviously, go to the A-Car, Kyle Busch, and RCR. 19 straight season where he was able to amass one victory. You look at the last 3 years, and he hasn't exactly been the dominant driver, but there is no doubt he put the entire field on notice, winning his first regular race. Daytona is what it is, but Fontana a little bit more of a measuring stick. And obviously, a lot of that will be applicable going forward. We'll see how they unload this weekend, a 1.5 mile track at Vegas. But I guess the overarching question that I have to ask, did you believe that the 8-car was the best last weekend on Fontana in the Swan Song at Auto Club Speedway?
I don't. I think that the best driver won the race. I do not think the best car won. I think that we would have had a really interesting race had Larson not had those electrical issues. I think that he probably would have been the best car. And I still have to say, I think that Ross Chastain had a better car than Kyle Busch. I know that I could probably get some, pushback on that. However, man, he was able to get stuff on restarts and make up a lot of positions, and he led 91 laps. I mean, that's a pretty damn good performance. And, when it came to just really long runs, Kyle was just Kyle Busch. And it's just a place where he runs well. It's a true driver's track. And I think that Kyle probably had the second or third best car, but he was the best driver on that track on Sunday. And that's why he was able to just get the season going early with an early win at Fontana.
And I think, to your point, that was some of the better commentary that we heard during the course of the race. Listening to some of the former drivers talk about Auto Club Speedway and the challenge it is for 200 miles at a tire wear track over the 200 laps, that you don't get cheap wins there. It's a driver track. You have to go out there, get the most out of your equipment. And we saw that play out. Most importantly, we got a long green flag run at the end so we could see who the best car was when we got into the closing laps. You mentioned Kyle and the exposure that you have to him this season. We've seen his over-under for wins for the 2023 season get boosted from 1.5 now to 3.5. You've seen his odds to win the series championship cut in half from that 12.5, 13-1 range. He's now a co-favorite alongside Chase Elliott. We'll get to Chase a little bit later in the show because it's still head-scratching with NASCAR's most popular driver. But when you mentioned Ross Chastain, what were some of the other takeaways that you saw from the race that may be lost to a lot of our listeners that are just tuning into NASCAR for the first time or aren't conditioned to look for some of the same things that we do before we flip the page and start to focus on some of the betting basics and obviously a comprehensive breakdown of the Pennzoil 400?
Well, I think that you have to look at just the situation that Tyler Reddick finds himself in and maybe even a little bit of Austin Dillon. I mean, you got to remember that Reddick had the best car there last year, which is the same car that Kyle's in this year, that 8 car for RCR. Kyle was able to get it done, and And he had issues as well. He not only had to go to the back, and I think he bounced off the wall a couple times, even late in the race. I was a little stressed out. I was so nervous I didn't even tweet out the stay green. I was like, man, I don't want to jinx it. But, I think it's kind of an interesting takeaway. Reddick really struggled in a Toyota. And, Austin Dillon, he's been in that same equipment for a long time and has not had the success that the 8 team has seen or someone, his teammate. So, it's a very interesting start to the season with basically, Reddick and Kyle swapping manufacturers, and you see tremendous success from Kyle right away. Had a chance in the 500 and goes out there and wins at Fontana, and he's got some great tracks for himself coming up in Vegas and Phoenix. So I think that, maybe Austin Dillon, how talented is Austin Dillon? He's got to be questioning that. And same with Tyler Reddick. Did he make the right decision? And I think long run, Reddick made the right decision. But I think short run, he's got to be, I think it's still in the back of his mind, like, what's going on here? And is Kyle going to win like 6 races as well? So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out.
Well, you mentioned Austin Dillon, and there's no doubt if Kyle continues to have success driving the 8 car, that there'll be pressure that gets ratcheted up on the grandson of Mr. Childers over there. So we'll see how RCR goes. But along those same lines, had a chance to listen to Denny Hamlin's new podcast, Actions Detrimental. Encourage all NASCAR fans to check that out as well. And there was something that Denny said in the course of that show, kind of casually, that blew me away, saying that it's widely known throughout NASCAR that RCR has the best engines. Suddenly, you take arguably the best driver of this modern era in Kyle Busch, you pair him up with an outstanding engine builder. The rest of the field should be awfully scared if the 8 comes in with this cool, calm demeanor, and he's spending time at go-kart tracks the night before to help team camaraderie and building among some of his fellow teammates.
Well, I think you're seeing just a complete transformation of Kyle Busch. I don't know if Toyota was a reason for a lot of the boos, but I didn't hear as many boos, and it seemed like people were fairly supportive of him. And I'll tell you what, no one would be surprised if he went out here and won in Vegas. He's won here before. He's excellent at this track. It's his hometown. And you're gonna spot Kyle Busch, kind of a 2-win advantage. And I'm not saying Stenhouse isn't a contender, but you're gonna spot Kyle Busch 2 wins coming into Phoenix.
I am. I'm saying no offense to Ricky Stenhouse if he's out there listening. He's not a legitimate threat for a 1-car team to win the Cup championship.
Yeah, you're right. But I just think that this could be one of those years that we haven't seen in a while. And like I said, I told the listeners last week, my Kyle Busch bias does need to remain in check. But I do think that if he goes out there and maybe even qualifies well, you're going to see odds makers react drastically, especially if you see Kyle and Kyle on the front row. It's kind of looking like it's shaping up to the Kyle and Kyle show based on what odds makers are saying. But this could be a real message if he's contending for wins early in the season and they're kind of clicking on all cylinders. It could be an interesting year for that 8 team.
And like we talk about all the time, everything that we do and will continue to do from now this weekend at Vegas until they hand out the championship at Phoenix in early November is price-driven. Odds makers have caught up to Kyle Busch. You're not pulling the wool over their eyes. You see some of the numbers right now that you're forced if you want to bet him in the outright market or if you want to bet him in some of the head-to-head matchups that aren't widely available that are out there. And we'll get in, obviously, into a little bit more specifics, a unique situation that'll develop this weekend for Kyle Busch as well that I think does have to factor into the overall calculus and the handicap. But before we get there, a lot more ground to cover, and want to encourage all of you, our loyal Stay Green listeners out there, to follow Chris on Twitter. That's at ChrisWormy15. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. And most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Forgot to share at the top of the show. Obviously, Stay Green, a Bet the Board production, part of the Wondery Podcast Network. As we pivot from stage 1 to stage 2, and we got some good listener questions, a little bit more on specific drivers that I think we can get to in stage 3, although, spoiler alert, if you guys are asking for more picks as part of the questions, not what that is designed for on social media, but we love to see the eager beavers out there. I wanted to have a slightly more comprehensive discussion about the state of the betting market. We're not going to talk about limits here. I know that affects 1% of the bettors out there, that we're in a very, very different bucket. But when it comes to some of the offerings that you've seen, you obviously are looking at a variety of books in a legalized sports betting state in Arizona. You have a number of options at your disposal. Have you been happy with some of the offerings that you've seen through the first 2 races of the season? Would you like to see a little bit more? I know this is going to be a hot button issue that'll carry on through the remainder of this season and obviously into perpetuity. But what's your initial takeaway for some of the offerings in the timely manner that they're coming up at the various shops?
Yeah, there's kind of collective panic, I would say, like Monday night when we haven't seen odds for the following week. I think that everyone's kind of like, hey, where are we going to get odds? And people get upset on Twitter, and you hear kind of just that small echo chamber of NASCAR bettors that are just looking to see odds come out. I think right now I'm okay with the selection. I think that I would rather have some more consistency and timing and just consistent week to week offerings than I would rather see like adding additional offerings, if that makes sense. I'd like to see just everyone carry, outright prices, top 3, top 5, top 10s, some sort of matchups. I'm not saying you need to list everything, but, I think Caesars has done a great job, to mention a book, on the number of availability and offerings. However, some of those markets, I would not wish my worst enemy to bet on. I mean, the hold is outrageous. And that's why it's important to have multiple books. I mean, I'm not playing a top 10 bet at Caesars. It's just not feasible long run. But there are some other books. I think the most consistent one has kind of been Barstool. They've done a great job of just having fair pricing. And I think it's really important that you're able to price shop and not only from you don't want to miss out on something. We had a comment like, oh, it's nice to have like an armchair winner. It's really hard to get those in this. I don't care who you are. There's not one professional sports player that says like, oh yeah, this is easy. It's just not easy week to week. So having, multiple pricing options at your disposal and also more offerings just helps. And right now, you can see when there's a high hold. I mean, they don't even try to hide it. So just be wary and don't force anything. I remember everything that we give out is very price dependent. And so, if it's a bet that we really like, we'll give parameters. But for the most part, we're kind of sticking to the number that we give out and maybe don't venture far from that number.
And I think that's an extremely valuable teaching lesson with all of it, because we saw Kyle Busch. We shared it at minus $1.50. I know some books closed upwards of $3. And while people are conditioned, okay, we understand the difference between betting an NFL game, laying 2.5 versus laying 3.5. The same thought process doesn't factor in when it comes to juice and the pricing in a lot of the NASCAR markets, because they look at it going, well, these guys laid $1.50. They still need him to finish inside the top 10, so I don't need to be as price dependent. We don't want you to kind of think about it that way. Obviously, bets are all price dependent, and we're making those decisions based on what the market is offering. We're not going to sit here and advise you guys to lay $3 on something like that we don't price in that range. And I think it's such an important lesson, one that we're going to beat the dead horse over and over again and try and drum into people's heads. Because when you look at those top 3s, those top 5s, and the top 10s, one of the aspects that I've been most critical of, and some books are better about it than others, that I would like to see change and become an industry standard, is start offering two-way pricing. It's extremely easy to continue to move prices and force bettors that want to bet a Kyle Larson or a Kyle Busch at minus $5 to lay those prices in the top 10. You know what? You'll know if that's a fair market reflection if you're offering a no price there and you're taking money one way or another. This is still NASCAR. Anything can happen. It doesn't matter what track we're going to. And honestly, Worm, I don't care what drivers are out there. If you're going to consistently give me a 4 or 5 to 1 price, if I'm able to take it on a no on a top 10, I may look to fade some of the top drivers, knowing I only have to win 1 out of every 5, or hope there's a little dust up somewhere in the field or a mechanical issue that allows me to be profitable over the course of a 36 race
Look
season.
at Kyle Larson. Kyle Larson was minus 700 at some shops for a top 10. I would have taken the against on that at 4.5 or 5 to 1, just out of principle. And then look, however many laps in, he's got an electrical issue and he finishes, double digits laps down. Now he's still had a fast car, but there's externalities in this sport that you just can't account for. And it doesn't matter how much you prepare. Long run, you're going to make money betting on a guy at 5 to 1 to not finish in the top 10. I just think that with the way that the sport's going, especially with tire issues and lug nuts, and there's just a lot of unknowns to, I feel like it's just kind of stealing when you say just give one-way pricing minus 700. I mean, let's keep them in check, offer a yes-no prop, and let's have an efficient market.
Exactly. That's all everyone wants to see, is truly efficient markets out there that we can have two-way pricing and at least understand exactly what we're betting into. You mentioned externalities, and obviously it didn't take us long for Mother Nature to have her hand and change some of the handicap dynamic that we were looking for. We love to give out a head-to-head matchup on race day, but of course with no practice and additional data points, we weren't able to do that last week. Hopefully this weekend in Vegas we are. How much for you did the handicapping process change last week when we got a full washout, not just of the Cup Series, but the Xfinity Series on Saturday? And does that relegate you, and maybe relegate's not the right term there, to doing a lot more live betting for a race like that than coming in with preconceived notions, knowing you can only glean so much information from reading and previous history with such limited data options?
Oh, not to mention, throw in the fact that Fontana is just a kind of a track all its own. And early in the season, with some changes to the car, I mean, I tried not to have an opinion at all, going into that race, and definitely took the live betting approach. It was like, hey, let's just see what happens when these cars unload for the first time. And I don't know if you were listening, but Kyle Larson said in a warm-up laps, he's like, I have some engine issues. I mean, at that point, I'm like, okay, great. Let's see where this goes. Because this is something that they would have found out in practice or in qualifying.
Yep. And
so it's kind of a bummer for that 5 team, because I do think that they had a race-winning car. But, I try not to have too much. I mean, we base most of our action or our bets on what we see in practice and qualifying. And it's without that, I'm not just going to make up plays. I mean, the goal is to make money long run, not for action. So there's been times when I've literally had no bets on a weekend, and I'm okay with that, because I'm not just going to fire whenever I think. It's not like I'm just picking out a car or throwing a dart at a dartboard. So it just kind of let me relax and enjoy my Saturday, and definitely was live betting heavily on Sunday.
Yeah, you're busy tweeting out pictures of Bloody Marys that look like it had 37 different things trying to float in your cocktail on Saturday, when you're normally supposed to be chained to your desk trying to figure out exactly what directions we're going in. But when NASCAR throws you a gift and we don't have practice, you're allowed to
Oh, man, it was great. This Haas Kitchen is just incredible. It's the ultimate order. It was a meal and a cocktail, and it was $15. It was like, I was like, that's kind of a small cocktail for $15. And the guy said, he's like, handed me like 2 little prongs. He's like, you can put as much on those as you want. I'm like, well, this is my meal now. So a couple of meatballs on there, some sausage. It was incredible.
Yeah, nothing like meatballs and a Bloody Mary first thing on a Saturday morning is, I'm north of 40, you're approaching, to try and deal with a little heartburn there. But I'm glad you were able to take advantage. Hopefully, again, in Vegas, the forecast does look a little bit better for this weekend. It will still be cold, but it doesn't look like we're going to have any of the wet stuff, at least the way things shape up now. And, of course, like we said, hopefully that gives us an opportunity to share a head-to-head matchup on race day once we have a little bit more data at our disposal. One last note on that, though. I understand there's a number of handicappers out there that use math models and everything else. They may not be nearly as dependent on practice and may do things over the course of historical sample sizes. I tip my hat to them. It's just not the process that you and I have found to be profitable. Again, so many different ways to skin a cat, especially in a sport like NASCAR, where you don't have to pick the outright winner every week. You can land 1 and 4 and still come home with a lot more money at day's end than what you started with going forward. Stage 3, as always, is the full race breakdown of what we're going to see on tap this weekend. And the Pennzoil 400 from Las Vegas Motor Speedway takes center stage. We'll have all 3 series, a truck race on Friday. Saturday, we'll have the Xfinity boys on track, and then, of course, the Cup boys will close out the weekend in style on Sunday. When you're looking at the overall Cup details, first 2 stages, 80 laps apiece. Final stage remaining 107 laps. We've seen Vegas obviously take on a little bit more tire wear. It won't be anywhere close to what we saw last weekend in Fontana. And as we always do, Worm, before we get into the individual drivers and we start to dissect and unpack what we can expect this weekend, when you're looking at Las Vegas, what are the track comparisons that you're factoring into the equation?
Yeah, I would say lightly Kansas and lightly Charlotte. Obviously, 1.5 miles, I would say they fit into kind of that cookie cutter. However, I don't take too much away from that. I think just if you can use your eyeballs and just kind of figure out who ran well in those races, I think it can kind of help have an understanding of how the driver fares on tracks like this. However, with the fact we have a new car, we've had 1 full year of it, I even kind of take the first Vegas race from last year with a little bit of a grain of salt, just because there were so many changes by the end of the year. So I am primarily going off of what we saw in Fontana from a speed perspective and expectation perspective, if that makes sense. And then also that second Las Vegas race in the fall. That's kind of what I'm looking at.
Well, you know what? That's a perfect opportunity that I want to ask. I mean, under old school circumstances, would you handicap the spring and fall races differently? We know how the weather changes quite a bit out here. I mean, you're expecting temperatures normally for the spring race in Vegas in the low 70s. In the fall race, I know they've slid it back a little bit further in October, but can it approach the triple digits? Clearly, you had the next-gen car last year, so a different dynamic. So as I rattle off some of the previous winners here, Joey Logano wins in the fall. It was Alex Bowman in the spring. Fall of 2021, Denny Hamlin grabbed the checkered flag. Kyle Larson, spring winner. And when you look at the 3 previous years before that, Kurt Busch in the fall, Joey Logano in the spring, Martin Truex Jr., Joey Logano in the spring, Brad Keselowski in the fall, and Kevin Harvick in the spring. So when you were coming at this, you kind of go, hey, look, I'm only going to lean on what I had for the most recent race, and I'm going to weight that more heavily than anything else.
Absolutely. And I kind of want to talk a little bit more about the expectation in Fontana, because
yeah, for sure.
I just think that's important to understand is, obviously I was high on Kyle and Kyle. I think everyone was going into Fontana, but there were some guys that actually surprised me to the good and to the bad. So to the good was actually Chase Elliott. He just kind of continues down this path of, I'm not going to make mistakes and I'm going to be there at the end. And I'll be damned if he was. So I thought that, that was a good run for that 9 team that was kind of average on speed all day. I thought another guy that kind of exceeded expectations was Daniel Suarez, and I think Ross Chastain. So I think those guys really exceeded expectations, at least my expectations for Fontana. And the last guy would have been Ryan Blaney. Does not typically fare well on high wear tracks, but I would say for the first third of the race, he was arguably the best. And, until he got mired back in traffic and found himself in some trouble, I thought that the 12 car was one of those guys that I did not expect to run well, but did. So, do you credit their driving style? I can't imagine their driving style changed too much. They may have learned a bit from last year, but also their car could be a little faster than it was the year before or previous years. So that's what I say by expectations at Fontana, if that makes sense. And then also just how they ran at Vegas. Those are 2 things that I guess I'm looking at just short term to go off of.
Well, I mean, normally we'd look to start with some of the favorites, and you talked about Kyle and Kyle, but I think rather than starting there, we may as well continue along that same wavelength and thought process with the driver that's actually taken a substantial amount of pre-week money. We had one prominent shop out here in Vegas open Ryan Blaney as high as 12. That price now down to 7-1 at the time of recording, and you've seen the rest of the market kind of fall in line. It still doesn't make Blaney the favorite, and there are some 10-1s that are available, but it puts them in that rarefied air saying, look, there are professional bettors that recognize the speed the 12 has shown and know he is going to be relevant despite not having a points race victory in the current next-gen car. You look at Blaney, back-to-back disappointing results here in Vegas last year, finished 28th in the fall, 36th in the spring. 3 previous trips, he'd had top 7 finishes in each race. And we look at the 2022 comp tracks, nothing to write home about there. What is leading, in your opinion, professional bettors, in the case you're kind of making, I think, indirectly, for Ryan Blaney to be a car that we should all be paying attention to before they unload and get on the track this weekend?
Well, he was, in my opinion, the best car at that Vegas race. And I know you look at the box score, you don't quite see, you don't see the top driver rating, and you don't see maybe the most fast laps. You see the second most fast laps. And you obviously don't have the finish, but he obviously got caught up in some late race stuff where guys had maybe stayed out on tires. They lost some, and by the way, this was a question Richard West asked about, is Blaney's pit crew going to get it together? Listen, Blaney's a guy that really needs that clean air, and he had it in that second Vegas race, and he kind of maintained that kind of top 5 running order. He was able to he was able to lose a spot or 2 on restarts in the last year's Vegas race and still get back to the lead. Now, if you put him back in 20th, it's going to take him a long time to get there. You won't see what happened at Fontana where Kyle Busch just raced back to the top 5 like it was nothing. Blaney has to be a little bit more methodical. His car needs to be, I guess, for a lack of a better term, more perfect than Kyle Busch needs in order to make these passes. So I'm hoping... I'm pulling for Blaney. He's just one of those guys where I feel like if he loses spots, he doesn't have that. He doesn't get pissed off and just go back and get those spots on a restart. So I think he needs to get a little bit more gritty. But ultimately, if he qualifies well, this is a great track for Penske just in general, or Fords in general. I think that you could see him run top 3 all day.
I mean, we may as well stay in the Penske camp and look at Ryan Blaney's teammate, Joey Logano, who has had a lot of success here at Las Vegas Motor Speedway in the past. The most recent data point, Joey Logano won here in the fall, spent the entire race inside the top 15, 32 laps led, tied him with Tyler Reddick, and we're behind only Ross Chastain. His driver rating of 130.6, the best in the field. And when we look at track history, hey, look, he's been the model of consistency with what he's been able to do. And while the comp tracks that you talked about lightly using Kansas and Charlotte as litmus tests weren't exactly ideal, this is a track where the 22 is going to feel extremely comfortable. And when he unloads, have to imagine he's got his eyes on the prize, thinking he's going to grab the checkered flag. And you're seeing Joey Logano price right now, widely available. Let's call it what it is. 7-1 on the low end, upwards of 9.
Yeah, I've even seen some 10s on Logano. I don't know if those have moved since this morning, but if you just look at his last 14 starts there, his average starting spot is 7.1, and his average finish is 6.5. He's got 3 wins and 7 top 5s. So clearly this is a comfortable place for Joey Logano. I anticipate him to qualify well. I don't know that he'll necessarily put it on the pole, but he will be mixing it up anywhere from 3rd to 5th place all day, I imagine, at the worst. So he showed great speed at Fontana, a place where he's been kind of on and off fast, so very consistent there. Just speed in the race car. I fully expect him to be competing for the win this weekend. I mean, 11 top 10s out of 14 starts there, the last 14. So definitely comfortable place for him. And last year when he won, he was probably second or third best car. But man, the X factor in Paul Wolfe. I mean, he pitted late when I think they were running like 9th, and he was willing to bring the cars down pit road when a lot of the leaders didn't. And I think he restarted like 13th, got a quick caution, and it wasn't long before he was hunting Chastain, and he made Chastain look like he was standing still. And the cool part about this is his tires were only 13-lap fresher tires. You used to not see that at Vegas. So this is great. Tire wear, we love tire wear. So to see Vegas start to wear out a little bit and, kind of punish the tires a little bit, definitely adds another layer, because some people will be taking 2 tires, some people taking 4, some people will be staying out. So it adds a little bit of strategy, which, if you're live betting and you're paying attention, you could find some profits there.
Have to imagine that if NASCAR sees too much tire fall off at Vegas, that we're going to have a repave in the near future, because heaven forbid that we get tire wear at tracks that create slightly better racing. But it has definitely been a lot more entertaining over the last couple of installments at Vegas than what we've seen in the past. From Team Penske, let's go back to the top of the board, and we can talk about the co-favorites, the Kyle and Kyle show that you alluded to early on in Stage 1. When you look at their pricing here, Kyle Busch as low as 6-1. You can find some 7s. Kyle Larson very similarly priced. And we can start with Kyle Busch. 1 career win here in 23 Cup starts, but 5 straight finishes of 6th or better at Las Vegas Motor Speedway. 3 poles, 11 top 5 finishes, 311 laps led, and 8 of 10 trips here, 7th or better, so obviously fade him at your own risks. When we look at 2022 comp tracks, yes, the 18 at the time wasn't exactly the model of consistency, but when you went to 1.5 and tracks that are going to resemble Vegas, Kyle Busch was an absolute force to be reckoned with, and I have to imagine it's rinse and repeat for the 8 car this weekend at his home track.
I think it's very important to recognize the difference between Chevy and Toyota. I think that the Toyotas last year, especially JGR, well, I guess no, I'll just say all Toyotas. I think they include 23XI in this. They were the fastest on 1.5 tracks. Now, that could have been because of aggressive setups, because it was really hard for them to get the finishes. When it came to long green flag runs, they were the fastest by a mile, but they were having trouble getting the wins and finishing races. So this year, coming in at a Chevy, and the other thing about Kyle, and we talked about this earlier in the week, he's running the Truck Series and the Xfinity Series.
That's, what, I'm glad you brought that up, because it actually slipped my mind, and I know we had talked about it off air, but do want to get your take on that, knowing that how much seat time he's going to get at Las Vegas Motor Speedway outside of just the Cup race.
Back, I would say the olden days, 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, Kyle was running a ton of truck races and a ton of Xfinity races, and he was winning more. I think that there's a direct correlation with seat time and track time and wins, or at least competitiveness. So the fact that we're going to see him this week in the Truck Series and the Xfinity Series, I always say that if you've run a race the day before or even earlier in the day in a particular weekend, you're one adjustment ahead. And I think that that's really important. If you're one adjustment ahead and you stay one adjustment ahead, that means that you're able to kind of stay out front especially ahead of, other people or other drivers that may not have had as much seat time. So if you give Kyle Busch a fast truck and you give him a fast Xfinity car and you give him a little bit of an advantage, no matter what it is, I mean, the guy's going to be up there. So it definitely hurts the betting markets when Kyle Busch is running in the trucks in the Xfinity, if you're looking to bet those individually, because you never know. I mean, he could be bad in practice and dominate, or he could look great in practice and dominate, or whatever. So, but I do think that there's just an element of comfortability with the track, and I think it's going to help him this week. It's certainly not going to hurt him.
Well, I mean, the truck race, I don't really have a strong opinion on what we're going to expect from Kyle Busch. We know going down there, he has typically been the dominant force by every sense of the word. Xfinity could be a little bit different, though, because he's not going to be driving the JGR Xfinity cars that he's grown accustomed to in the past.
Yeah.
So I am very curious to see how some of those lines move, because you get a lot of good drivers in that 6.5, 7-1 range that may have better equipment than Kyle Busch. Look, they can't match up as terms of overall talent, and Kyle will get the absolute best out of the Kaulig racing car that he's in, but let's see exactly if that machine is race-winning worthy. So something to watch for those folks who also bet the Xfinity on Saturday. Kyle Larson, of course, the other Kyle that we talked about, misleading result you highlighted at the top from Auto Club last weekend. The electrical issue had him 15 laps down early in the race before they fixed it. Vegas history, second in the spring, 35th here in the fall because of a nice little dust up with Bubba Wallace. But 7 top 10 finishes in his last 10 trips here. 2022 comp tracks, I mean, the numbers don't lie. Second in Vegas, second in Kansas, 9th in Charlotte, 8th in Kansas. Obviously, the 5 should factor into all of your wagering decisions this weekend.
Oh, I think so. And the other thing, too, is I think that for the limited time that Kyle was on the lead lap, I do think he was the best car at Fontana. He was probably a top 5 last year at Fontana. Not a dominant performance at all, not what we expected, especially coming off that 2021 season that he had. So I think that, it's, like I said, Kyle and Kyle show. If one of those guys qualifies well or even pulls it, you're going to see their odds just plummet. And, you're going to have to either invest a lot of money to make any money on Kyle, either Kyle for that matter, or, they qualify poorly or they make a mistake in qualifying, and hopefully we can find some better value, maybe in matchups or maybe even an outright price. But I fully expect Kyle Larson, by the way, no surprise, Kyle Larson will be good at Las Vegas at a 1.5-mile track. You heard it here first, guys. Kyle Larson will be fast.
Really going out on a limb there. I applaud you for putting your neck out there saying that the 5 car will be a force to be reckoned with this weekend. 2 other drivers that I would put in that kind of favorite category, especially the way they're being priced, although one of them you can say maybe more of a value proposition, will be Ross Chastain and Denny Hamlin. I feel like anytime we talk about these two, it definitely makes sense for us to group them together. Chastain led the most laps at California last week at 91. Average finish at similar tracks last year was amongst the series best. Vegas history, throw that out. It's completely irrelevant before the 2022 season. But you saw the 1 car constantly pick up spots at restarts. He is ultra aggressive, and it pays dividends in terms of where he's finishing. Trackhouse racing good last week. No reason to believe that Trackhouse won't be a factor inside the top 10 all day on Sunday.
Yeah, and crazy enough, in the fall race at Las Vegas, he also led 91 laps, had the best driver rating at 137.6, but he did not have the most fastest laps. So that just goes to show you that Ross Chastain, he's very aggressive and is able to pick up spots on restarts where other guys might be a little bit more timid and kind of maybe hang back. And you know what? This might make him find some trouble in the race. He's very aggressive, but hey, you want your driver to go out there and try to get as much as he can. So I think that Ross was probably the second best car behind Larson last week. I know that he didn't win the race and Kyle passed him in the end, but I think, you have to look at his performance in that same car last year at Fontana was not spectacular at all. So the fact he came and backed it up and showed some speed, and then also showed speed at Vegas too. I think Ross Chastain could be a contender to win this thing. Now, I think he's overvalued right now, and here's why. He never looks like a rocket in practice. Ross Chastain's always looking for feel, and I also think that he's going to qualify poorly. I don't think that he has a great track record of qualifying well, especially at these 1.5-mile tracks, especially at the second half of the season last year. So I'm not rushing to get Chastain. I think if you're looking to get Chastain, you're probably going to have to look live because I feel like he's just going to be overvalued until we see what he has actually in the race.
Well, and I think Denny Hamlin, a guy that you brought up a great point when we were shooting the shit about this race and some of the guys that we were going to look for. Also another one that becomes a tougher driver to handicap in pre-week markets because there always feels like there's such a wide range of performances that we get from the FedEx 11. Recent history in Vegas, 4 top 5 performance. There was a 32nd mixed in there, the lone outlier. Before that, though, I mean, Denny wasn't shy. He said he didn't like going to Vegas. He struggled there immensely, but clearly he's figured it out. And at 1.5-mile tracks, when we look back at last year's race, Denny wasn't there in the same breath as his JGR teammates, but Martin Truex Jr. and Kyle Busch were both very good. You have to imagine some of that setup can obviously translate for Denny this year in the spring race, and he can carry some of that momentum that we saw in the fall.
Denny's tough. Denny's races, I mean, sometimes he's the best car and sometimes he's terrible, and that's in one race. Like, he goes from being the worst car to the best car, back to average, back to great. He's a really tough guy to handicap, and I think it's just he is a gritty driver. That's a guy that's going to get the most out of his car at all times. And so if he's got an edgy car, he's probably going to put himself into position to make mistakes, and I think that hurts him in the long run. But also when he has a great car, that's why he goes out there and leads laps. He's a really, really hard guy to handicap. He can win anywhere. I think that we can all agree Denny Hamlin can win anywhere. And
boy, you're a wealth of knowledge
Thank
today
you.
with all of these bold statements.
Yep.
Kyle Larson is going to be relevant at 1.5-mile tracks, and newsflash, Denny Hamlin can win a race anywhere.
Yeah, he's just hard to put your finger on, in my opinion, especially with this new car. I wouldn't be shocked if he ran 12th, and I wouldn't be shocked if he won the race. That's kind of how I feel about Denny Hamlin. And until he gets to start putting consistent finishes, in the top 3 or top 5, he's going to be tough to get involved with pre-week or pre-practice and qualifying at this point in the season.
And Denny, when you look at his pricing throughout the market, safe to say that I'll call his consensus 10-1. That's a number that's widely available. Of course, prices do vary. Shop around if you want to put Denny on your pre-week race card. When we look at some of the other drivers, obviously we have to talk about the biggest names. At Hendrick Motorsports, we hit on Kyle Larson already, but I think his other trio of teammates can oftentimes be grouped together. We know we're going to have to pay a premium to try and back Chase Elliott. Alex Bowman and William Byron, it's anybody's guess in terms of what you're going to get from the 24 and the 48 on a week-in, week-out basis. But what I find fascinating about Chase Elliott is there is a wide range of prices available on the 9 car in the outright market right now. I've seen a low of 10-1. I've seen upwards of 15-1. And when you grade out the entire camp, I can sit here and I can say it straight face that Chase Elliott is overvalued, but that he's obviously going to exceed our pre-week expectations. Green flag speed wasn't really that great at Fontana, but he's a guy that gets the most out of his equipment, and unless there is a mechanical issue or he gets shuffled back, is going to find himself to be relevant. Just 1 top 5 in his last 6 trips here to Vegas. That second place finish came in the fall of 2021. And you look at some of the comp tracks as far as 1.5 were concerned in 2022. 9th in Vegas in the spring race, 29th at Kansas, 33rd at Charlotte, 11th at Kansas 2, and 21st in Vegas 2. Some of those finishes and what we've seen week in, week out speed-wise from the Napa 9 car don't suggest that he should be priced amongst the elite drivers.
I mean, of his 12 visits to Vegas, he only has 6 top 20s. That is crazy. We're talking about the championship favorite at this point last year. Not at this point last year. Well, probably at this point last year. But going into the Vegas race, he was still the championship favorite, in that round of 8. And he, with no issues, ran straight up 21st. That is not a team with speed. And I'll tell you what, he got a lot out of that finish at Fontana. I mean, he was kind of hanging around all day, but, again, making no mistakes. And you got to give Gustafson some credit for getting that car where it needed to be for him to make some moves late to finish second. However, I just don't think that this Vegas track is good for Chase. And I know I'm going to have a bunch of Chase fans, coming at me nails up, but I just don't think that this is a good spot for him. Now, it could bode very well if he does come out there and perform well. So I'm not going to say I'm optimistic, but I have no problem turning optimistic if we do get a good run out of this 9 car, because this kind of sets the stage for 1.5 for the rest of the year. So if he shows up at a track where he historically has run poorly and runs well, I think that he could be setting up himself up for a great season on these 1.5 mile tracks, and we know how he runs at short tracks. So could bode well for the 9, but I'm not optimistic at this point.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm very curious to see when I look at the screen right now as far as some of the head-to-head matchups that we can expect to be widely available involving Chase Elliott. Christopher Bell, Denny Hamlin, Martin Truex Jr., and, of course, Chase Elliott's teammate, William Byron, which when you look at Alex Bowman and William Byron. Alex Bowman won here in the spring, 21 fastest laps, had the second highest driver rating in the field, but only led 16 laps in that race, his lone win of the season. And you look at Bowman over the course of the full 2022 campaign, he only had 3 more top 5 finishes in his final 33 starts after winning at Las Vegas. The last 5 trips to Vegas, it's kind of been feast or famine. 2 top 5s, 3 finishes 13th or worse. And then when you look at William Byron, never finished better than 5th here. 4 of his 6 trips to Vegas have been 13th or worse. However, he did finish with the 3rd best driver rating in the spring race. 98% of that race he spent inside the top 10 to top 15. So it begs the question, we've talked about Kyle Larson being a guy that you're going to have to be very weary of or cognizant of in terms of what he can do at this track. But his trio of HMS teammates, it feels like there's a wide range of performances. And if I'm putting this on a bell curve, I'm going to have a lot more potential negative outcomes than the expectation that the 9, the 24, and the 48 are all going to be top 10 to top 12 worthy cars.
Yeah, these 2 drivers they're kind of the, obviously, I guess you could call them the second or third or 4th kind of, Hendrick Motorsports drivers. But they are very different in my opinion. I think that if Bowman unloads poorly, he does a better job of getting the most out of his car, if that makes sense. And Byron is the opposite. Like, he either unloads like a rocket and then competes for the win, or he unloads like a dump truck and you're lucky to keep him on the lead lap. So you kind of have a wide range for these 2 drivers. Now, I wouldn't be shocked if either one of them unloaded well and ran in the top 5. I think I'd expect that more out of William Byron than I would Bowman. And I know that Bowman did recently win there last year, but Bowman had a great car that day. And you know what? If you give Bowman a chance to win, I know that they call him a hack. I call him clutch because he races against the top drivers in the world, and you put him on the front row late in a race, and you're going to get all you can handle because that guy knows how to finish a race and go out there and win. So, I never am super there's not like a track where I'm looking like, oh man, I can't wait to jump on Bowman or I can't wait to jump on Byron, at this track, just because we're not quite sure how they unload. And I think how they unload really determines how their weekend goes.
Hey, it's a fair assessment, and I think odds makers struggle, obviously, to try and price these guys to begin with as well. I mean, you're looking at William Byron, a low of 12-1, shop around. There's some 17-1s out there if you want to use him as part of your pre-week decision-making process. Alex Bowman, 20-1, 22-1 thereabouts. And to your point, if they unload well, these are drivers that books are not afraid to shorten odds on and have them go off in that 10 to 12-1 range, or in the case of Byron, maybe even in the single digits. Yep. Any more than they would be to shorten the odds on a driver that has really been the model of consistency here, but oftentimes gets overlooked. That, of course, being Martin Truex Jr., the driver of the 19 car. 12-1, kind of the market rate right now. And you look at what Truex has done in Vegas, and I was kind of blown away as I put together some of these numbers. Last year, 7th place finish, 8th place finish. Before that, 4th, 6th, 4th, 20th. Outlier there with the 20th. 1st, 8th, 3rd, 4th, 1st. An average finish in the last 11 races in Vegas of 6th, and that includes 120th place finish. I mean, 6th highest driver rating in the spring race, 34 fastest laps, had a legitimate chance to win late until he got shuffled back. And then, of course, the fall is what it is. But Martin Truex Jr., another driver that I think is worth discussing because there's a very real chance that he could go off as the favorite if we see that speed in practice that we've grown accustomed to.
Yeah, and qualifying. I think in order for him to go off as the favorite, we're going to need to see him qualify better than he has, I would say, in the past year or two. But, man, average finish is 2nd over the last 14 races behind Joey Logano, and it's not by much. I mean, Joey Logano's average finish is 6.5, and Martin Truex Jr.'s is 6.6. He has the same amount of top 5s as Truex, Keselowski, and Kyle Busch, and he's got the same amount of top 10s. This guy could go out there and win this race, and I would not be shocked. I think that we do see, we've seen anywhere from like 12 to, I think, 14-1 on this guy. But you know what? We also saw him go out there and win the Clash in an aggressive way. And I think he's got a good legitimate chance to win some 1.5 mile tracks this year. He showed speed last year with all of the Toyotas on these 1.5 miles. He fits in that category. And by the way, he knows how to win races. So I think that the clash maybe gave him some of the confidence he needed. I know that he struggled in Fontana a little bit. Early was great. I mean, I think he had passed the most cars, after the first 5 to 10 laps, and then obviously had some issues. But the only reason I know that is because I had some live bets on him that I had to sell for a loss as he continued to find issues. But I would not be shocked if Martin Truex went out there and won this race. I would be shocked if he qualified in the top 6. So hopefully we can see some speed on the long run from him, and we find a little bit more value on that outright price relative to where he qualifies.
Yeah, he's a driver, honestly, that when I was going through some of the post-race metrics and logging all the data, I didn't realize he finished 11th last week because I don't feel like I ever heard his name mentioned during the course of Stage 3 whatsoever. So we'll see if he can be a little bit more relevant and work his way towards the front of the field this week and attract, to your point that you mentioned, how good he has been in the past. He's definitely got the track record to back that up. When we start to look a little bit outside the box at a group that I'll call long shots, and I'm not quite sure any of those guys should really be considered such, you get to the Kevin Harvicks of the world at 20-1, Daniel Suarez at 25-1, although Suarez did open as high as 50-1 at some shops. That number didn't last. I saw him as 30, 35. He's kind of been beat into line with a price that I think is much more reasonable for the 99. Bubba Wallace as well was great here in the fall, got into the dust up with Kyle Larson. Who knows how the 23 car could have finished. But when you look at those trio of drivers or anybody else that you want to include, are there any guys that stand out that you think are worth discussing in any capacity as we look to try and unpack the rest of the field that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I just want to talk about, I guess, these 3 guys individually real quickly. Listen, Kevin Harvick, this will be the same story that we say all year, so just get used to hearing it. Kevin Harvick will look average in practice. He will qualify poorly, and he will race better than both of those 2 things. That's just it. So whether he can get up there and race for the win, I don't know. I wouldn't be shocked if he did, and I wouldn't be shocked if he didn't. He's very hard to handicap. Obviously, he's a driver with his the amount of experience he has. He's looking for a feel in a race car. He's not looking at those stopwatch when it comes to lap times in practice. He's going to get as much as he can out of qualifying, but ultimately he knows that if he can find himself in a long run with a comfortable car that can work on both the top and the bottom, he's going to be there at the end. So when it comes to Daniel Suarez, this is different. I think that Suarez showed more speed in Fontana this year than he did last year, and I know everyone's going to say, but no, he had a chance to win last year. Yeah, I understand. That's with the top 4 cars not being in the race. So this was a legit great run for Daniel Suarez, in my opinion, at Fontana. He also had great runs in Vegas, in the fall. In the spring, I remember I faded him, but I remember thinking part of the way through the race, whoops, I should not have faded Daniel Suarez in the spring. Fortunately,
well, this was also, keep in mind, folks, for anybody out there who didn't listen last year or doesn't know any of Worm's background, he looked to try and bet against Daniel Suarez in nearly every matchup he could, going back to, 2018, 2019, as long as he thought the car that Suarez was paired up with could maintain minimum race speed, that Suarez was going to be a guy he was going to look to fade in one way, shape, or form.
This is true. But, I was also still skeptical of Trackhouse, but I just remember thinking, it's very important to look at your bets objectively. I mean, that's just so important. And I remember thinking, even though I'd faded Suarez across the board in the spring race, I remember thinking like, oops, I shouldn't have done that because this guy's going to be way better. So he beat my expectations. Then he goes out, and I think on the short run, I thought that Chastain and Suarez were the fastest in the short run in the fall Vegas race. You go ahead and couple that with the fact that he was, a top 5 car at Fontana. I think that there's a tremendous amount of upside. I think that the books were right to move him from 50 down to 25. I think that that's pretty solid price. And, if you miss that 50-1 or 40-1, maybe he won't qualify well, but I do anticipate him to qualify in the top 10. And I think that he'll lead laps this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, the 99, look, 99 and 1 have brought it seemingly every week. I mean, some of their in-race management, at least more so for the 99, can oftentimes leave a little bit to be desired. But it hasn't been because Trackhouse isn't giving him a race-winning car, or at least some of the capabilities that we've seen lately. And last, I know the one driver that you also wanted to touch on was Bubba Wallace. One thing I will say with Harvick, for those folks who do watch some of the head-to-head matchups, let's see if history repeats itself for the way he gets bet. Because to your point, Harvick doesn't show that speed in practice, doesn't qualify overly well, and it felt like every single Sunday morning last year, Kevin Harvick got steamed against in all of his head-to-head matchups. We know some of the other big betting groups out there, the metrics, the data they're looking at to make some of their informed decisions, that I almost joked with you. I go, well, we'll let them steam against him, and I'll just take every plus money price on Harvick, figuring if he goes 2-2, I'm going to be able to put a little bit of hay in the barn. But Bubba Wallace, the other guy, I don't think he was overly good last week at Fontana, but obviously we saw what he could do at mile-and-a-half tracks. Kansas and Vegas showed a lot of speed last
Yeah, absolutely. I think he had a race-winning car when he lost his ever-freaking mind on Kyle Larson. So Bubba's his biggest, hurdle is between his ears. I think that he has a ton of talent as a race car driver when it comes to, tracks where you don't have to conserve tires. I think that's where he struggles. I think you could throw Blaney in that bucket too. So he's not the only one, but I think he has a ton of talent. And when his car is fast, man, he's fast. And he just kind of has this chip on his shoulder, but almost not the good chip, like I could lose my mind on my crew or my crew chief or even on another driver. And until you're able to just kind of have a cool head, I think that's going to hold him back a little bit. But I'm pulling for him to win this week if I don't show my hand a little bit. I think that, he had a fast race car. I thought the Toyotas were fast on mile-and-a-halves, and Bubba can get it done. He showed that he could do it at Kansas. I think that he could do it again this week at Vegas. But also, let's not get too involved at this point. Let's watch him unload. And here's the other thing. He could qualify well, too. Bubba can put it up there.
When we look at 23XI this year, do we think we could see them take a step back because they don't have that consummate veteran Kurt Busch in their camp? That Bubba Wallace and Tyler Reddick don't have nearly as much time in the seat as what Kurt Busch was probably able to lend to the overall welfare of the team with experience, feel, and everything else that goes into putting race-winning cars out there?
Todd, I'm not going to lie. I'm kind of looking out the window at the sky thinking maybe Todd has a point here. That could be something that maybe gets overlooked. I have not thought about that. I have not heard anybody talk about that before. I think that everyone just assumed that Reddick was an upgrade. And there could be something to that, kind of calming vet voice that, as a driver, not necessarily, obviously there's veterans that are on these teams, but to have another driver that's a true vet could have been really beneficial. That's a possibility. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that 23XI organization plays out this year.
Yeah, kind of curious. Just something that I was thinking about when I was looking at some of the notes, trying to figure out. Obviously, Kurt Busch grabbed headlines this past week, given the fact that, hey, look, Kyle Busch wins another race. They become the winningest brother tandem in the sport's history. A credit to them and everything that they've meant to the sport. Obviously, coming to Las Vegas this weekend where both Busch brothers hone their craft. You can follow Chris on Twitter. That's at ChrisWormy15. I'm Todd Furman. You, of course, can follow me there as well. Most importantly, as always, follow all things Bet the Board at Bet the Board Pod. And Wormser, this is the time of the program where we put everyone's feet to the fire. We try and condense, consolidate, distill down all of the great nuggets you've shared with our loyal listenership over the last 45 plus minutes into the one most actionable pre-week element. Where are you taking us on this magical mystery tour for Las Vegas Motor Speedway's Pennzoil 400?
All right, I'm checking to make sure it's still available here because I do not want to give out a price that's gone. Okay, it is still there.
Yeah, you can't. Here's the thing. You can't go burying these numbers before we share with our listeners. You have to wait with bated breath. The show goes live because I don't need to sit here and have you pound your chest. Oh, we gave this out, and if nobody else can get it, we become those guys that we most despise in the sports betting space. I know,
and you got to keep me in check. If I ever do that, I expect full criticism from everybody.
Oh, you'll hear from me. Don't worry about that. I ain't gonna hold back.
But sometimes yours doesn't carry as much weight. So maybe from the maybe from other listeners might carry more.
All right, there's your call. There's your CTA and your call to action, listeners. If Worm is full of shit, call him out.
Yeah, I want to hear it. So we're going to go with another top 10, and it's also going to be the same price. I am going to go with Ryan Blaney, top 10 minus 150 as my bet, the best bet going into practice and qualifying. I thought he had a race-winning car here last year. He exceeded expectations at Fontana. I know the finish did not show it. However, I think that this team's going to get a win here this week, and if it's not this week, it could be next week. So I like that top 10 bet. just because I think there's the most value there. I think that I'd rather get that top 10 at minus 150 than I'd get that top 5 at 2-1, and maybe couple that with a win bet after practice and qualifying if he looks good. But I think that the top 10 is the best bet on Ryan Blaney minus 150. That's at Barstool or Canby or Bet Rivers as well.
And just a quick to kind of revisit how we're going about prefacing your position sizing for this. 20% of your stake comes on this, or how exactly are you looking at it? Half of what you're offering up for, assuming that we are going to have another bet that we'll add to the card.
Yeah, I would say half. I would say that this is a good spot to be half of the bet on Sunday. Perfect. And that's, unless I feel like the Sunday bet is much better, we'll make a note. I'll make sure that we get that kind of communicated properly if it is something we want to bet more on. But right now, I would say just half of the bet that you plan on making on the Sunday's best bet, I would make on Ryan Blaney at minus 150.
Perfect. That's all I wanted to clarify. Make sure all of our listeners out there can learn the best way to approach money management. We know as it comes to some of the biggest NASCAR races, they're going to have multiple investments there and want to make sure they're properly structuring their bets and building their portfolios. All right, my friend, another podcast in the books. We pumped up your tires a little bit more than I would like with the call last week about Kyle Busch. Rocking chair top 10, gets the outright winner and sets things up quite nicely for a lot of our season-long positions with the A-car. We'll see if he can follow it up this weekend, but clearly another 1.5-mile track in the wake of a 2-mile high-speed tire wear track. Going to learn a lot about these cars and where they are over the course of the West Coast swing as we'll head to Phoenix next week, maybe with a special guest in tow to help us break down the race. But for Chris Wormy, I'm Todd Furman. Thanks to all of you, our loyal Stay Green listeners, for tuning in as always. Wormser, any final words of advice, parting shots you'd like to get out before we close up shop?
Go Blaney.
All right. Hopefully come Sunday afternoon with a Ryan Blaney top 10 ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.